The silence of the Apex propulsion server vault was a high-tech vacuum, sifting through the scent of ozone and unearned power. Julian Vane, the 35-year-old CEO who viewed human beings as line items, stood over 9-year-old Toby. A silent alarm had tripped, and the boy was caught near the primary bus. Julian didn't see a child. He saw a nuisance. He looked at Toby's frayed hand-me-down sneakers, then back at his own $4,000 loafers. "You smell of cheap soap and failure, kid," Julian sneered, his voice a clinical blade. "Your father is a janitor, a biological dead end who cleans the toilets of men who actually matter. You're just a glitch in my system."
Toby didn't flinch. He stood perfectly still, his eyes tracking a microscopic flicker in the server rack's cooling light. He looked up at Julian with a terrifying, stoic calm. "My dad says people like you only win because you haven't met the man who built the floor yet," Toby whispered. "You'll regret this." Julian barked a jagged laugh, but the sound was instantly swallowed by a subsonic throb that vibrated the very reinforced concrete beneath their feet. The sterile white lighting of the vault suddenly shuddered and shifted into a pulsating, rhythmic chairman purple. It was a protocol no one in the building had seen in a decade. Julian's smirk disintegrated. The boy knew the one secret the CEO's billions couldn't buy. The architect of the Iron Wall was already in the room, watching the shadow. The Apex Propulsion headquarters was a 30-story spire of obsidian glass and architectural arrogance that overlooked the city like a silent judge. Inside, the lobby was a cathedral of curated silence, filtered to a surgical grade and chilled to a precise 68 degrees to protect the thousands of microsensors embedded in the walls. This was the birthplace of the Mach 7 turbine, a place where people didn't just work, they performed excellence.
2 hours before the alarms turned the building into a red-lit tomb, it was take your child to work day. For most of the executives, this meant showing their children a corner office and a view of the harbor. For Elias Thorne, it meant bringing 9-year-old Toby to a supply closet that smelled of ammonia and industrial-grade lavender. Elias was 42, a man of functional muscle and scarred knuckles that told a story his resume had been scrubbed to hide. He wore a blue jumpsuit with a name tag that simply read Elias. He moved with a rhythmic stride, pushing a mop bucket across the high-gloss executive hallway.
He didn't look at the art on the walls or the awards in the cases. He looked at the floor, searching for imperfections. To the engineers who called this place home, Elias was a ghost. He was the background noise, a biological utility unit tasked with erasing the physical residue of their brilliance. Toby sat nearby on an overturned plastic bucket, his legs dangling. He wasn't playing on a phone or watching cartoons. He was hunched over a heavy, dog-eared technical manual for the Apex Centrifuge, a book meant for postgraduate researchers. His lips moved slightly as he traced the stress vector diagrams with a small finger. He had his father's eyes, the color of deep reef water, and a stillness that most adults found unsettling.
"The third stage weld looks thin on the diagram, Dad," Toby whispered, his voice small but steady. Elias paused his mop. He didn't tell the boy the book was too hard. He leaned in, his shadow falling over the pages. "It's a compensation for the thermal expansion of the lithium-ion core, Toby. The weld isn't thin, it's elastic. If you make it rigid, it snaps when the heat hits. Remember, the strongest gear is the one you never hear." The silence of the hallway was shattered by the rhythmic, sharp click of leather on marble. Julian Vane, the CEO of Apex Propulsion, rounded the corner leading a group of 4 high-profile delegates from the Ministry of Defense. Julian was 35, dressed in a charcoal suit that cost more than Elias made in 2 years. He moved with a predatory energy, his eyes constantly scanning for anything that didn't fit his vision of perfection. He was mid-sentence, barking about quarterly throughput, when he saw the glitch in his hallway. He saw the mop bucket. He saw the janitor. And he saw the boy sitting on a bucket in a clean zone. Julian didn't slow down. As he passed, he intentionally swung his leg, his polished loafer catching the corner of Toby's engineering manual. The book flew out of the boy's hands, sliding across the marble and landing face down in the gray, soapy water of the mop bucket. The delegates stopped. Toby stared at the bucket in quiet shock. Elias stood perfectly still, the mop handle gripped tight in his calloused hand.
"I apologize, gentlemen," Julian said, his voice dripping with calculated disdain. He turned to Elias, his eyes raking over the blue jumpsuit with visceral disgust. "It seems our biological filter has decided to turn the executive corridor into a daycare center. Thorn, isn't it? I thought the orientation emphasized that maintenance staff are to remain invisible during business hours." "It's take your child to work day, sir," Elias said, his voice a low, disciplined rumble. Julian laughed, a sharp, dry sound. He gestured toward Toby, then toward Elias, using them as a prop for the amusement of the delegates. "Take your child to work day is for people who have actual work to show their children, Elias. What exactly are you teaching the boy? The proper ratio of bleach to water? The art of emptying a trash can without making eye contact?" He walked closer, stopping inches from Elias, the scent of his expensive cologne clashing with the smell of soap. "Look at the boy's sneakers, Elias. Frayed, hand-me-downs. This is what I talk about when I mention hereditary mediocrity to the board. You are a biological dead end, and you're raising the boy to be the same. You carry the smell of the basement, and you've managed to get it on the boy, too. Men like you are only here because the robots haven't learned to use a mop yet."
General Sterling here has a smudge on his left boot. Since you're already on your knees most of the day, Elias, why don't you show your son how a real Thorn earns his keep? Clean the general's shoes. Now. The silence was a weight. Toby looked at his father. His small hands were clenched into fists. He saw the scar on Elias's palm, the remnant of a turbine explosion 7 years ago. He saw the man who had built the very engines the general was here to buy, now being ordered to scrub his boots. Elias didn't look up. He looked at Toby, a silent command for the boy to stay calm. He slowly knelt on the cold marble, reaching for a clean rag. "Yes, sir," Elias said quietly. As Elias worked, Julian stood over him with a smirk of absolute triumph. He believed he had established the hierarchy. He believed he had shamed a man who was beneath him. But Toby was watching. He saw the way his father's steady hands didn't tremble. He saw the secret strength in the silence. "You'll regret this," Toby whispered, loud enough for only Julian to hear as the CEO stepped back. Julian didn't even register the boy's voice. He was already leading the delegates toward the centrifuge bay, his voice rising again as he spoke about the future of power. He left the janitor on his knees and the boy on his bucket, unaware that the foundation of his empire had just been compromised by the very man he thought he was erasing. The mockery was complete. Julian Vane had established his status. But in 60 minutes, the machines would begin to scream, and the biological dead end would be the only one who knew how to make them stop. The basement of Apex Propulsion didn't have a soul. It had a heartbeat. It was a labyrinth of sweating copper pipes and reinforced concrete, a space that smelled of steam, grease, and the heavy, honest scent of old iron. This was the boiler room, the only place on the 300-acre estate that felt real to Elias Thorn. They sat on 2 overturned milk crates near the primary-secondary exhaust vent. Elias opened a stained canvas lunch bag, pulling out 2 simple ham sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. Toby took his without a word, his small fingers tracing the oily residue on the paper. The boy's engineering manual was still damp, tucked into the pocket of his jacket, a casualty of Julian Vane's arrogance. He stared at the water damage. "Does it hurt, Dad?" Toby asked, his voice barely audible over the rhythmic thrum of the industrial heaters. He wasn't talking about a physical injury. He was talking about the way his father had knelt on the marble to scrub a stranger's boots. Elias took a slow, deliberate bite of his sandwich. He didn't look at the dirt under his fingernails. He looked at Toby. Pain is just a signal, son, like a red light on a dashboard. It tells you that a system is under load, but it doesn't tell you how to fix it.
He leaned back, his shoulders filling the narrow space between the pipes. Julian Vane thinks power is something you wear. He thinks it's the car he drives and the volume of his voice. But Julian has never built anything that can survive a storm. He's a consumer of other people's brilliance. In the engine of life, Julian is the chrome on the hood. It's pretty, but it doesn't move the car. Elias put down his crusts and drank water. The secret burden Elias carried was the reason they were sitting in a basement instead of a mansion. 7 years ago, the name Elias Thorne had been the most protected.
He had a wife, Sarah, who was the only person in the world who could outcalculate him. A rival corporation, desperate to steal the blueprints, had attempted a kinetic acquisition. Elias had responded by burning his own legacy. He had taken a black badge retirement, surrendering his patents and scrubbing his name from every public record in exchange for a new identity and Toby's safety. He became a ghost. He took the janitor job at Apex, the very company that had bought his stolen designs, because it was the ultimate hiding place. No one looks for a legendary engineer in the man holding the mop. He protected the only truth that mattered to him now. Toby reached into his collar and pulled out a small object on a black nylon string. It was a simple titanium calibration nut, the edges worn smooth by the boy's constant fidgeting. It was a piece of high-purity aerospace-grade metal, an artifact from the first Prometheus core. Elias reached out and touched the cold metal. "Do you know why I gave you that, Toby?" The boy nodded. "You said it's the most important part of the machine." "It is," Elias said, his voice dropping into a low, steady rumble. "A calibration nut doesn't produce the thrust. It doesn't scream like the turbine. It just sits at the center of the shaft, holding the balance. If it's off by 1,000th of an inch, the whole engine tears itself apart. Most people in this building are like the loud gears above us. They grind and they screech, trying to prove they're the strongest. But the loudest gear is the one that's failing. It's the one experiencing the most friction. The strongest ones, the ones that actually hold the world together, are the ones you..." He looked at the boiler room ceiling, his ears filtering out the hum of the heaters to catch a different sound, a subtle, high-pitched slip coming from the centrifuge bay 2 floors up. He knew that sound. It was the Mach 7 turbine entering a thermal harmonic phase it wasn't designed to survive. The experts Julian had hired were pushing the machine past its tolerances, blinded by the software simulations that couldn't account for the physical reality of the weld lines. Elias had spent his life listening to metal, and right now, the metal was telling him that Julian Vane's empire was starting to crack. He knew he should stay in the basement, but as he looked at the calibration nut around his son's neck, he realized that a man who builds foundations cannot watch them crumble, even for the sake of invisibility. He felt the weight of his old life returning to his hands, a phantom wrench calling him back to the surface. "The noise is changing, Toby," Elias said, standing up and closing his lunch bag. The stoop in his shoulders was gone, replaced by the lethal, focused posture of the architect. "It's time to go." Toby stood too, his reef blue eyes reflecting the orange glow of the furnace. He tucked the titanium nut back under his shirt. He didn't ask if his father was scared. He knew that the man who built the floor was finally ready to take it back. Above them, the building groaned, a low, visceral protest of steel against ego. The reckoning was no longer a warning. It was a physical reality.
Elias looked at the clock. The time had come to confront the shadows and reveal the truth.
The Mach 7 centrifuge did not resemble a machine. It resembled a weapon of economic warfare. It sat in the center of Test Bay Alpha, a 3-story cylinder of carbon composite and reinforced titanium that hummed with the predatory energy of a caged predator. This was the crown jewel of Apex Propulsion, the primary reason the Ministry of Defense had sent its most powerful delegates to the building today. Julian Vane had staked the company's entire fourth-quarter valuation on the success of this demonstration. Surrounding the centrifuge was a phalanx of experts, men in white lab coats who viewed the physical world through the sterile filter of high-definition monitors. They were the digital architects, men whose hands were soft and whose eyes were fixed on the neon green flicker of the Aegis 10 software. To them, the machine was a simulation. They believed that if the code said the system was stable, the physics had no choice but to obey. They were looking at a dashboard that showed a 99.9% efficiency rating, oblivious to the fact that the floor beneath their feet was starting to develop a microscopic subsonic shudder. They were monitoring the core temperature and the rotational velocity, but they were ignoring the one thing that actually mattered: the sound of the metal. In the maintenance crawl space directly above the bay, tucked into the shadows of a heavy-duty air filtration unit, Elias Thorne lay on his stomach. He wasn't looking at a monitor. He was holding a rusted screwdriver against the steel vent, his ear pressed to the plastic handle, using it as a rudimentary stethoscope. Beside him, Toby sat in the cramped darkness, his reef-blue eyes reflecting the dim orange light of the service lamps. The boy didn't need to ask his father what was happening. He could feel the change in the air. The rhythmic thrum of the building had shifted into a jagged, uneven cadence. "Do you hear the ghost, Toby?"
Elias whispered, his voice a low vibration that seemed to bypass the ears and settle in the boy's chest. Toby leaned in, his small frame tensed. "It's the second stage bearing, isn't it? It's skipping a beat." Elias nodded, a grim smile touching the corners of his mouth. "It's not just a skip, it's a harmonic slip. The software is programmed to look for peak-to-peak amplitude, but it's sampling at a rate that's too slow to catch the intergranular stress. The centrifuge is rotating at 80,000 RPM, creating a centripetal load of 10,000 Gs. The experts think the vibration is just background noise in the signal, but they're wrong. Look at the weld line on the secondary manifold." Elias pointed through the vent slats toward a jagged seam in the titanium casing below. "The thermal runaway hasn't started in the core yet, but the friction in the housing is causing the piezoelectric sensors to desync. The metal is heating up to 1200 degrees, and the weld bead is entering its phase change. It's becoming brittle. In exactly 4 minutes, the centripetal force is going to find the weakest point in that seam. The manifold will fail, the coolant will vent, and the god of Apex will become a..."
He remembered the engineering manual face down in the soapy water. He remembered his father on his knees, scrubbing a stranger's boots. He realized that if the centrifuge blew, his father would be the one blamed for the maintenance failure. He wouldn't be the architect. He would be the janitor who forgot to tighten a bolt. "We have to tell them, Dad," Toby whispered. Elias shook his head slowly. "They won't listen to the background noise, Toby. To them, we are the dust they have to erase. They only believe in the screen." But Toby wasn't ready to accept the silence. He was a child of the shadows, but he was the son of the man who built the floor. When Elias turned back to his screwdriver to track the accelerating frequency, Toby didn't wait. He slid backward through the crawl space, moving with a silent efficiency he had learned from watching his father. He exited the vent through a service door on the 3rd floor and ran toward the executive wing. He didn't have a badge, and he didn't have a suit, but he had the truth. He found Manager Graves, a man with a clipboard and a permanent expression of professional irritation, standing near the server vault entrance. Toby grabbed the man's sleeve, his voice frantic but clear. "The centrifuge manifold is about to fail. You have to stop the rotation.
The harmonic slip is hitting the weld line. Graves looked down at Toby's hand-me-down sneakers and the paint stain on his jacket. He didn't see an engineer's son. He saw a nuisance. "Who let you out of the basement, kid?" Graves snapped, jerking his arm away.
"The experts have everything under control. Go find your father and tell him to clean the spill in the lobby. This is a high-security zone." "But the piezoelectric sensors are desynced," Toby shouted as Graves walked away. "The manifold is at 1200 degrees." The manager didn't even look back. Toby stood in the hallway, the red emergency lights beginning to flicker as the first signs of the thermal runaway finally hit the building's primary sensors. He saw the doors to the server vault slide open, a high-security sanctuary where the building's root kernel was stored. He knew that the vault was the only place where he could access the manual override. He slipped inside just as the silent alarm tripped. He was caught in the cold blue light of the obsidian server racks. Within seconds, the door hissed shut, and Julian Vane entered the room like a god entering a temple he had forgotten he didn't build. The CEO was already in a state of high-status irritation. The investors were asking questions he couldn't answer, and now he had a biological failure in his primary server room. Julian stood over Toby, his presence a dark cloud of charcoal silk and predatory intent. He mocked the boy's sneakers. He mocked Elias's career. He used the boy as a target for all the frustration he felt about the machine he couldn't command. But as Julian screeched, Toby didn't move. He stood perfectly still, his eyes tracking a microscopic flicker in the server rack's cooling light. He looked up at Julian with a terrifying stoic calm that silenced the CEO's next insult.
"My dad says people like you only win because you haven't met the man who built the floor yet," Toby whispered. "You'll regret this." Julian barked a jagged laugh, but the sound was instantly swallowed by a subsonic throb that vibrated the very reinforced concrete beneath their feet. The sterile white lighting of the vault suddenly shuddered and shifted into a pulsating, rhythmic chairman purple. It was a protocol no one in the building had seen in a decade. The architect's protocol. The software Julian worshipped had just been overridden by a physical command that lived below the digital layer. The room's temperature began to drop as the liquid nitrogen purge engaged, but the vibration in the floor was accelerating. The viral hook moment was now. Julian Vane stared at the boy, then at the pulsating purple light, and for the first time in his career, he felt the cold, hard weight of a reality he couldn't manage with a spreadsheet. Toby looked at the door, then at the clock. 9 seconds, Toby said. The centrifuge bay below let out a scream that shook the building to its foundation. The experts were about to learn that the background noise was the only thing holding up the ceiling. The reckoning was here.
The sound the doors made wasn't loud. It was a soft mechanical click, followed by the muted sweep of air as they opened inward. But in a room already charged with uneasy laughter, it carried. Daniel Reeves stepped inside without urgency. He didn't scan the crowd or search for cameras. His eyes went straight to the stage, then to his son. He wore a dark jacket over a work shirt, sleeves buttoned, posture steady. There was nothing theatrical about him. No raised voice, no rushed stride, just focus. A corporate assistant near the aisle stiffened as he passed. She recognized him before she could stop herself from showing it. Another executive shifted slightly in his seat, whispering something under his breath. Daniel acknowledged no one. On stage, Victor Hale had begun to turn back toward the audience, prepared to smooth the moment into something forgettable. Then he saw who had entered. It wasn't fear that crossed Hale's face. It was calculation. "Mr. Reeves," he said, the microphone still amplifying his voice to the back row. The laughter in the auditorium thinned into silence. Daniel stopped at the end of the aisle, but didn't step forward yet. His gaze moved briefly to Ethan, who stood straighter the moment he saw his father. No dramatic gestures passed between them. No nod, no wave, just recognition. Most of the parents had no idea who Daniel was. To them, he looked like what he was, an ordinary man in an ordinary jacket, arriving late to a school event sponsored by someone powerful. But the executives seated along the right side of the auditorium were suddenly very attentive. Hale adjusted the microphone slightly lower, a subtle move, almost unconscious. "I wasn't aware you'd be attending," Hale said, the polish still in his tone but tightened at the edges. Daniel's reply carried without the microphone. "I wasn't aware my son's calculations would be dismissed publicly." The room didn't erupt, it contracted. Teachers exchanged glances. A few reporters shifted in their seats, pens lifting. Victor Hale held Daniel's eyes for a fraction too long, and for the first time that morning, it was unclear who was in control. 6 months earlier, Daniel Reeves had stood. He walked the structure alone that day, clipboard tucked under his arm, measuring deflection tolerances, reviewing weld points, running independent load calculations against the architectural summary he'd been given. The numbers didn't sit right. They were technically compliant on paper, but only if environmental stress remained within a narrow band. Under peak load, combined freight weight, wind shear, temperature shift, the cross-bracing would absorb more stress than the current reinforcement pattern allowed. He recalculated twice, then a third time. 12% over threshold. 12% was not theoretical. 12% was collapse under the wrong conditions. In the follow-up meeting, Daniel didn't dramatize it. He simply placed his report on the table and said, "The reinforcement grid needs to be adjusted. Add diagonal bracing at the secondary joints. You'll lose some interior clearance, but you'll gain structural margin." The room had gone quiet. Victor Hale had listened without interrupting, fingers laced loosely in front of him. "We're within code," Hale said finally. "Barely," Daniel replied. "And codes are written for averages, not extremes." Hale's legal advisor had leaned in then, speaking carefully about contractual obligations and delivery timelines. The engineers present avoided eye contact. The revision Daniel suggested would delay the launch. Delay meant cost. Cost meant explanation. Daniel refused to sign the final approval sheet without modification. 3 days later, he was informed that the project would proceed under internal certification review. His consulting contract was not renewed. No confrontation, no argument, just paperwork. Back in the auditorium, that unfinished conversation hung invisibly between the two men. Daniel took a step closer to the stage. "Did you review his load calculations?" he asked, nodding toward Ethan's prototype. Victor Hale didn't answer immediately. The audience assumed it was a rhetorical challenge from an overprotective father. The executives in the second row knew better. Ethan's model was simple on the surface: foam board, scaled beams, labeled stress points. But the math taped discreetly to its base wasn't elementary school guesswork. It mirrored the same warehouse configuration Daniel had reviewed months earlier. Same spacing, same support assumptions, same stress profile. Only this time, the failure point was color-coded in red. Silence stretched thin across the room. "I glanced at them," Hale said at last. Daniel nodded once. "Then you saw the deviation." The CEO's jaw tightened slightly. "It's a student project." "It's correct," Daniel said. There was no heat in his voice, no raised volume, just clarity. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. A few taps and a PDF appeared on the screen. He held it up, not theatrically, just enough for the front rows and cameras to see the header. Independent Structural Assessment, Hale East Expansion. Report date, 6 months prior. "I flagged the same issue in my audit," Daniel continued. "Peak load failure under 12% variance." Murmurs moved through the crowd now. Not laughter, confusion. A reporter in the third row leaned forward, phone raised discreetly to capture the screen. Another whispered something to her colleague. Daniel lowered his phone, but didn't pocket it. "My son didn't embarrass you," he said evenly. "He applied the same math I did. He just didn't know it was inconvenient." That word, inconvenient, landed harder than accusation. Victor Hale's composure remained intact, but the margin was thinner now. He knew what the room didn't yet. If the flaw Ethan identified became public record, it wouldn't just be an awkward moment at a school event. It would raise questions about compliance, oversight, liability. The warehouse was operational. Freight moved through it daily. And there were journalists present. The tension was no longer symbolic. It was tangible. A camera near the aisle zoomed in slightly. Daniel did not press further. He didn't threaten. He didn't dramatize collapse scenarios. He simply waited. That restraint was what made the moment dangerous. Because now the choice belonged to Hale. Double down? Dismiss it as a misunderstanding? Preserve authority? Risk scrutiny? Or acknowledge it and concede that a 10-year-old's model exposed a flaw his team had minimized.
The auditorium held its breath. And for the first time that morning, Victor Hale looked not at the audience, but at the numbers. Victor Hale inhaled slowly and stepped back from the microphone, his voice controlled as he suggested that perhaps this discussion would be better continued privately backstage. The proposal sounded reasonable, polished, corporate. Daniel didn't raise his voice when he answered. "If there's something to clarify," he said evenly, "we can clarify it here." The refusal wasn't confrontational, but it redirected the balance of the room. Hale paused, aware of the phones lifted in the audience and the reporters leaning forward. Retreat now would look evasive. He returned to the microphone, posture straight, expression measured. "Mr. Reeves' prior assessment did identify a margin concern in one of our facilities," he began carefully. A ripple moved through the crowd. "And it appears Ethan's model reflects that same calculation." The words hung there before he added more plainly. "The analysis is technically correct." The shift was immediate. Teachers who had smiled nervously earlier avoided eye contact. Parents recalibrated their assumptions. Ethan stood steady, eyes level. Hale looked directly at him this time. "You were right,"